Okay, so welcome everybody to another Neuro Nuggets podcast with myself, Dave Palfreman, my resident mulling expert Fiona, and I'm joined today amazingly by Jasmin Stevenson. And just to give you a bit of background, so Yas is trained as a forensic psychologist and is a research lead. I'm working on a lot of stuff around research, and the question I really want to ask today, and we'll get into this in a bit more detail, but the question that was on my mind is, when we are looking at research and we're looking at the science, how do we know that science is, or that, the information that we're given is good, it's solid, it's effective, and it's usable, and it's not snake oil, it's not just made up to sell a book, or it's not somebody spouting something without having solid rigor and background to it. So that's my question, and I guess I've got a few smaller questions in there, but yeah, I mean, as a starting point, yeah, what does research mean?
It's a big question, James.
Good question. Starting with the big questions.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're thinking about research, I guess we're thinking about it in its most formal sense, in terms of people are perhaps starting with a problem or an area of inquiry, and then they're wanting to delve deeper into that, answer it somehow, or they might be starting with a really general assumption, perhaps, or actually not knowing where a research question and topic might take them. And again, if we're thinking about it in that formal sense, you're starting with this question, you're going a bit deeper and collecting data usually to help you answer that.
Yeah, I guess there's lots of levels of research, isn't there? From us being curious about something. So, we might think, oh, I don't know, how does neuroscience relate to my job? How am I going to find out about that? And so we might just delve into some personal research around what literature there is out there. How can we answer the question? We might, I don't know, connect with something like ChatGPT to answer it. But there's the other end of the spectrum, which is getting into real formal research, that cause and effect understanding. That, I'm so curious about this question. I want to find out, does it work? What do the majority say? What's causing that? So I guess it depends what you're trying to find out. I think in terms of what we do, it's trying to assure people that when we do things like use applied neuroscience, that it's not just based on, I don't know, a flight of fancy. There are so many books out there, and some really good books, but they're written from a personal perspective. And I think we can learn a lot from those. But then actually, do we see the research in those? How do we know that what this person's telling us is something that, has been delved into as evidence-based? So it's trying to answer those questions, really. If you really want to get into developing an evidence base around something, that's where research and research methodology kicks in, I think.
Right. And I guess that's one of the things that's really interested me is, there are a lot of great books out there, and that, as you're quite rightly saying, and yeah, is somebody just writing come up with a bit of research to sell a book, or how do we explore a piece of research that says it's worth it's worth its bread and butter? I don't know how you would express that in a better way, but how
is it rigorous? Is it
valid?
That's
the word. Thank you. How's it rigorous?
So, Dave, sorry, your question there then was, how do we know what to look for when we're thinking about this research rigorous, and if it's any good, worth its bread and butter, as you say? I think it can be hard to discern if perhaps you're not used to delving into the literature. And like you've mentioned, there's a lot of great books that we can start to read, whether it might just be, if we're thinking of, let's say, popular science books, for example, whether that's things from self-help to I don't know, the best way to manage a team. And we'd hope that things like that do have a solid evidence base to underpin them, and that the authors have got their ideas from somewhere. Even that would take a little bit of digging, I think. But typically, I suppose if we're thinking about neuroscience and psychology, we're getting a lot of our research from research papers, which we would hope have been published in what we as researchers would consider reputable journals. They've been cited by a number of other authors in the field. And they always start with a really strong foundation, or at least you hope they do, of the theory that has underpinned their need for this research in the first place, followed by a really clear and explicit understanding of how they've tackled their question, you know, the methods that they've decided to use to answer a particular phenomena. And then we're looking to see if the conclusions that they're drawing from the results sort of match up or make sense in terms of what's known about a particular topic. And then I'm sure, as we'll go into, there's a whole host of different ways that we can begin to look at that with a critical eye as researchers, I suppose, in terms of the kind of sample that they've used, the applicability beyond the context in which, let's say, experiments or surveys or interviews were done, to think about how we might apply them into the real world. So there's quite a checklist of things we'd want to be looking at. I don't know what Fee.
Yeah, I think if we talk about the intelligent professional, but perhaps lay person who's looking at a book and thinking, is this psychobabble? Are these myths, you know, or is this based on evidence? What you'd want to do really is try and interrogate the referencing. So if we look at the reference, we'd be hoping that it would be published by a reputable publisher or peer reviewed, which means that it's been looked at by a number of people in the field who are considered experts, either in the subject matter or in methodology. And I think those give you a good measure of whether it's been based on evidence. That's exactly what we're looking for when we are thinking, is this a good book over, is this a good book? And it's not just a bedtime reading thing. But it's quite complex. Research can be really complex. When we're looking at something relatively new like neuroscience, we've only probably got 20, 30 years now of research and its applications to the real world. So when we think about all that scientific study around neuroscience that's looking at how the brain functions, but we move into now applied neuroscience. So what does that mean in the workplace? Like the sort of work we are doing, how do we use neuroscience to encourage well-being in the workplace? You know, how do we reduce stress and burnout in the workplace? We're wanting to know that actually what we're suggesting to people is based on hard evidence. And I think that's where we maybe need to cut through some of the terms as well that are used. So if you think about terms that are used a lot now, neuroscience is becoming really popular, isn't it? We might hear things like brain hacks, neural power, brain power, all lovely, good stuff. You know, we use those as well. But actually, if you get behind it, is it based on some robust evidence? You know, are we using terms that are scientific? Do we know what they mean? Yeah. Are we acknowledging the limits of something and how far we can apply it? Are we going beyond these are the results to how it applies in the real world practice and critiquing that? Those are some of the initial things, but as Yaz says, you can go a lot deeper than that with research. There's kind of a checklist almost, isn't there, Yaz, around how you decide, is this robust? Is this valid? Do I want to believe this? And research is always evolving too. So whatever might, you know, if research might have found 10 years ago could change now. So it's thinking about, have you got current research around this as well?
Yeah, I think that's partly one of the things that was sticking in my head about, you know, evidence bias of, you know, we're seeing a piece of information that backs up my belief, my thought, irrespective of whether that evidence is fair and you know, and adequate, and whether there's an opposing view and whether I've listened to that or not. And I guess that's you know, one of the things that I think really is, I find quite interesting of,
yeah,
looking for the right evidence, but am I just looking for the evidence I want, or am I
is it
looking for
solid?
the,
Yeah.
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 Does it then stack up? Can I break that? Can I break my belief? And if I
Yeah.
can, then, you know, obviously there's some, you know, I need to then rethink my thought. But if there isn't a counter evidence, or, you know, this piece of research stacks up, then, you know, then that seems to, for me, kind of makes that more valid. And I'm just wondered if that's kind of your perceptions as researchers. You know, does that hold water? Is that effective?
I think you raise a really good point around, I think, the degree of openness to which people might have in terms of approaching research. And are we trying to, I guess, find pieces of work that maybe adhere to a narrative or argument we have in our head, or are we open to the possibility that something might, you know, contrast with the initial thinking that we have? And I think a lot of researchers would probably agree that whichever side of a fence you sit on, you can probably find some research to back up both of the sides.
Yeah.
I suppose we'd hope in terms of, if, you know, you're wanting an answer to something, that you can be relatively open-minded in terms of balancing up, you know, the relative arguments on either side. And I think for me personally, this is why I maybe come across as quite an indecisive person sometimes, because actually I'm so aware of like opposing and
All the
contrasting
things.
arguments.
Yeah.
Actually,
Yeah.
I'm scared to put a foot in either camp, because there's always a caveat. You know, even the most healthy food could probably be counteracted in some way by some literature somewhere. So I think this is where, and touching upon what Fee was saying about thinking about how old a piece of evidence is or how up to date it might be, particularly in a field like neuroscience, it is relatively new, but things are progressing perhaps quite quickly in terms of, you know, new technologies and all that kind of stuff. So if we can think about looking at research that is as new as we could possibly, you know, hope to find, or at least the last 5 years, you'd hope that the arguments people begin to bring forward in those are more balanced and up to date in terms of the knowledge that we have now, if that makes sense.
An example might be, if you think about the brain and how we used to talk about it 20 years ago, we used to talk about left brain, right brain, triune brain, whatever. And actually research now, as it's moved forward, has found that the brain's highly networked. So you don't have a particular side that you do this with and a side that you do that with. It's networked, it reads across, and it's all also down to our central nervous system as well. So it's not just our brain, but the brain and the central nervous system are the things that bring that data in and how we process that. So that's a big change in neuroscience world. It's happened really quickly in terms of research. So you'll start to pick up more research around how the brain's network. That, you know, that is in recent years. What we then need to do is look at how that research study was set up and taken place, and you know, what the results were. So if they only asked 5 people or looked at 5 people, we're kind of going to think maybe that wouldn't be, it's not definitive, or is research ever definitive? It's got to acknowledge the limitations. It's got to have actually looked at a good robust sample group to be able to determine that. And it could be new and emerging in the field of research if it's, you know, a smaller piece of work, but actually it probably needed exploring further. And I guess that's what we're looking for when we pick up a piece of research, is to think, okay, how have they set this up? What's the methodology? Is it a good, robust methodology? What are the parameters of that? I know Yaz teaches about this a lot, don't you, to students who are, you know, just going off and doing research maybe for the first time, is what does that checklist look like? What we can't do is use a one-size-fits-all in neuroscience. We have the evidence that we have, but we've got to remember that the human dynamic of applied neuroscience means that we don't all experience things in the same way. So when you're looking at research and applying it in neuroscience, you have to think about the people and the environment that they bring, just as a starter, really.
Do you know what, that while you're talking there, it kind of raises two questions for me.
Yeah.
The first one is, what then would be a red flag, or that kind of dispels those neural myths, or there are neural myths that that stuff, or this research doesn't have enough substance. So what's the, is there a, I mean, and you mentioned there, like, if the sample size is really tiny, then that might wonder, is it has it been opened up to enough people? But what would be a red flag that says this research isn't really robust, or worth, stands up?
It's a good question. There's a few different things we could think about. I mean, one of the first things to consider, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the research isn't robust, but as researchers, if you're conducting primary research and writing it up, you have to declare if there's any conflicts of interest. And so I think if we're thinking about whether it's neuroscience or thinking about physical sciences like medicine or nutritional science, whatever it might be, thinking about who's funded this piece of research, and could there be a bias in how the results have gone, and or at least how it's being spoken about post that. And I think there was a really great example once where it might have been, well, a very famous fizzy soft drink brand had funded some research to say that actually their diet version is probably not so bad on children's teeth or something like that. But actually, it was only compared to the original, which was probably really quite bad. But actually, overall, it's still not great for your teeth. But actually, the way in which it was, put forward better. Made it sound like actually it was better. So just being discerning in that way. Suppose other things might be, again, not necessarily robustness, but it might affect how it's applied. So if we're looking at, let's say, I don't know, research that looks at young children, for example, and then we're extrapolating that data, and someone's using the research that was done on 5-year-olds to apply to 14-year-olds, you might be thinking, well, actually, how is that comparable? What's the applicability there? So you might just want to be more discerning about who the research has done with and where it's being applied to, and what they're saying is the kind of, the takeaways from the research and where that could go.
Most research, when it's written up, will include some of the limitations around it and some of the recommendations for further exploration. And you want to know that they've done that, because that's the discussion, and the limitations, etc., are actually a real critique of, this is what we found. How does it apply? How does it compare to other research that's been done around this? And so, because it's ever evolving, that should always be there. We should always have recommendations for what needs exploring further. If there's big, bold statements like, I don't know, do this breathing exercise and stress will be totally eradicated, that's what we found. Actually, is that true? Could we replicate that with another group of people? What does other research say? So you've got to be able to look at it in the grand scheme of things, rather than just go, okay, that's brilliant, let's all do that.
Brilliant. That's really helpful, that. And I guess so that then moved me on to my second question is, and I think reading pieces of research, because sometimes they're really big, they're really long, and can be quite difficult to read in places. So are there some hints and tips on how to read a document and understand a piece of research? Is there what are your tips for how to, if you're not used to reading a research document, how would somebody go about doing that and get, and understand what's going on in that?
One thing I'd always say to students is to start with the abstract, and this is where we would typically start as researchers looking at a piece of work. And so the abstract is always a short summary at the start of a research paper, which just explains what it is, what it looked at. It'll give a brief sentence or two on the results, and then a brief word on applicability or limitations going forward. So they're always a really great place to start, because you can quickly get a sense of, actually, is this relevant to my topic? Is it worth me looking at? often as well, what we'll see with research papers is that they might be behind paywalls, which is very frequent, whereas the abstract is always going to sit in a place where you can actually access it online, so you can at least get a sense and then go from there if you want to try and find it. It will also cover the keywords that are pertinent to whatever the research topic might be. So it's always good to go away and give them a quick Google if you don't understand what they are, because that's going to be the main focus and bulk of the research paper. So in terms of a first thing, that's where I'd go. I don't know if he has any other thoughts for a first port of call.
I agree, really. Back in the olden days when I was doing my PhD and we looked at paper articles rather than online, I had a huge mound of them, and I'm like, how am I going to read all this, and how do I know if it's relevant? So I think the abstract is a really good starting point. It should set out, like Yaz said, you know, does it connect with what I'm looking at? Is it going to help me consider this question? And it should have the methodology in there and a bit about the sample and a bit about the findings. So that's a great place to start. I think as well, as you then start to get into it, what's really helpful is if they've operationalized some of the terms that they've used. So actually, almost like, this is what I'm going to say, and this is how I expect to look at it. So does it do what it says on the tin, or are we just coming up with a big vagary that we've got no clue about? Even with, you know, wider narrative research that, you know, we're talking to people or we're looking at texts, at least they should define what it is that they're looking at the beginning. And potentially some of it should have the methodology that they're looking at as well, and a good description of why they've chosen that over something else. Not everything has to have numbers in it. You know, I'm a huge advocate of qualitative research. I think hearing people's stories is so important. And, you know, it's just making sure that they've got that right. So we are hearing people's stories and it fits with the context of what we're trying to find out. And, you know, we chose this sample because, you know, we wanted to look at, I don't know, what 5-year-olds think about sleep or etc. But yeah, as Yaz was saying, you know, when we start to look at the findings, we want to think of, is it relevant? Is the discussion relevant to that cohort that we've actually researched? You can't look at a 5-year-old and say, let's look at other research for 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, because we know the developmental pathway for the brain for little ones and for older teenagers is so different that it's hard to compare. So it's like, who are we looking at when we've got our findings? How do we discuss those? What other literature do we draw on? I know, Yaz, you might have some other ideas as well.
Yeah, I think they're really great ones that Fee's drawn upon. And I suppose once we're, let's say, looking at this research paper that we've read the abstract, we think, great, this sounds right up our street. Maybe you've had a little scan through. I think typically we'd move straight on to the discussion, particularly if we think, right, I just want to get to the nuts and bolts of what's been found. And the discussion is often very much easier to read than the results section, particularly where 100%. It might have been a quantitative study with very complicated tests that were run to kind of get the results that they found. So the discussion is really helpful because what it's going to do is contextualize the results, and it will always start with a brief summary at the start of that section, just to say what was looked at, probably why it was looked at, and it kind of go into it from there. So that's a good place to start. And then if you're happy with the discussion, you can begin to work backwards almost through the research paper. So you might end up reading the introduction last. I'd say a caveat to that is if you want to, how we were talking about earlier about understanding different arguments of different sides of a particular argument. Excuse me, I just need to clear different sides of a particular argument. We might want to start with the introduction, particularly if we're reading a more up-to-date research paper. And let's say you're thinking, I'm a bit strapped on time. I don't have time to, you know, research or Google the whole entirety of a theoretical debate on, let's say, a particular neuroscientific principle or theory, whatever it might be, an introduction in an up-to-date research paper is a really great place to start, because often they're comparing them for you. They're talking about the history, the theory, everything that's led them up into this particular point where they're going to venture onto the research question that they have. So yeah, if you're wanting an appraisal of a particular area and a particular landscape, I'd say having a look through the intro is good. And then just to follow on from that, the intro is going to be peppered with so many references and citations that you can follow up if you want to go down the rabbit holes and learn a bit more about anything specific and have a look at other researchers in the field. So yeah, that'd be my plan of attack personally.
Brilliant. And I guess that's and I suppose of just thinking then of I think places online have their place, I suppose. And I'm thinking Wikipedia as an example, where we often say never use Wikipedia, but there are other places like PLOS One and Harvard Business Review and places like that. And I'm just wondering how, what your thoughts on those are, because there's more than once where I kind of done a Google search, I've done an online search, and it's sent me to a Harvard or wherever, and then you start following the links through, and you go, okay, I've now got, until eventually you get a piece of paper or a research document that you can start checking. But yeah, why not Google? Why not Wikipedia, or and why maybe PLOS One? And I think you've probably already touched on this, but I guess I'll just for the listener.
Yeah, Wikipedia, I think it has its place. It's interesting, especially if you want to know about a star's relationships or whatever. But,
yeah,
not that I do that, but it's just thinking, yeah, it has its place, but anyone can put stuff on Wikipedia. It's kind of built by what people know and don't know. So there can be quite a few myths on there if you're not careful, or inaccuracies. Some of it's actually referenced. So, if you look, I don't know, if you look about somebody's theory of whatever, there'd probably be a Wikipedia page on that, and you can follow up with the references there, but I wouldn't use it as a general reference for, say, you're going to do a piece of academic work, or even, start to write up a blog, but it's referenced. Just make sure that you're using the original source. That's what we always say to students anyway. Don't just go off what somebody said might have happened. Just check that it's valid and the source is there. I don't know PLOS One, Dave. Tell me about that.
So it
sounds like a dinner date.
So it's PLOS One.
Oh.
ONE, but okay. Yeah, PLOS One, and they do a wide range of publications of research documentation, from like hardcore physics to medicine and everything in between. And it's one of the ones I kind of come across and use periodically. If I'm kind of searching for something, and I can put a search parameter in, and then it'll give me a whole range of stuff that people have published, which I believe they often peer review on there as well.
So I'd say that's probably, I don't really know a lot about Wikipedia and how much it's peer reviewed. I know they do take things down when they're pointed out that they're incorrect or whatever. But I think if you're starting to get into something being peer reviewed or moderated, you've got more of a chance of it being valuable information. And then, there's right at the other end where you've got online journals that are peer reviewed by a bunch of experts. You probably know you're going to get into some fairly useful stuff there, but I would still approach every paper that I look at in this way is, in some of the things we said already, is if you really want to dig down and check, what does this mean? What does this mean for my work? How do I apply this? Can I replicate this? Then the checks and balances you would want in place, really.
Yeah.
Yas might have something to add to that.
Just really agree with what you've said. And yeah, PLOS One, it does state that it's a peer-reviewed, open access scientific journal. So it sounds like a good place to start. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think like I just going into AI, and I know there's a huge debate around that, but use of generative AI. So it's really useful if you want to do a quick and dirty, tell me about this subject, and you can instruct it to pull in references, etc. But we do know from experience that it can sometimes make stuff up. And so if you have got references from ChatGPT, follow them through, because sometimes you'll find that they're not actually in existence, or perhaps they're a front page of something and you can't get any further, or there's just a general reference somewhere and actually it's not the original source. So it's just, they're all tools, I would say, just from my perspective, that widen our reach that we could never do as an individual on our own. So that's brilliant, but it's just making sure you have those safeguards and checks in place.
Yeah. I mean, I'd certainly echo that. I think there's a few times where I've kind of, can you give me a synopsis on a piece of information, and it's interestingly given me the wrong author, or and when I've challenged that, it's gone, okay, yeah, I see, and then
it wheedles its
gives
way
me
out of it.
Yeah, and so it's and that's fine if you're aware enough of that information. But if you're not, and you're asking an AI to give you that information because you don't know where to start from, that's where we can fall foul, isn't it? So sometimes then being able to request a reference then gives you a bit of a degree of confidence in what it's giving you, because you've got somebody that's spent a bit more time doing the research and writing that up. So brilliant. I think that feels like a really good place to kind of start to bring it to a close.
I just think as a final piece really is, don't be scared of research. Just approach it from the place of, does it stand up? Does it have the right things in place? Can I check through what would I look for? So some of the tips we're giving you. Yeah. So don't be scared of it, because there's so much information out there that's so wonderful that we can connect with. Yeah. Definitely.
Brilliant. And go on. Any last thoughts on that from you, Yes?
Just that I agree with Fee, and I think the more you start to look at research and just apply a critical lens to it, then the easier that will become. But I think, if you don't have the time or you are unsure, then if there's people in your network that can help with that, whether, I don't know, well, thinking through Academy, of course, or us on LinkedIn, or if you're looking at, like you say, Dave, before, Harvard Business Review, or organizations, networks, people that you trust to almost do that hard work for you in terms of, letting you know what is robust research, and that they would kind of hold it all in balance before telling you about it.
I think that's what we pride ourselves on, really, is that whilst we talk about neuroscience and how we apply it, we do want that level of rigor behind it. So, we might use some of the words that are helpful for people who just want to understand what that term means. So we're using layman's terms as such, but actually we do want to make sure the science is there. So all of our work is based on that. And so almost we're debunking the research for you in the way that we talk about it. And we can help guide you through that as well. So, we have people who are experiencing research like today. So we can help you if you find it a struggle.
Brilliant. Well, once again, thank you. What an amazing conversation. And yeah, I look forward to the next with enthusiasm. So brilliant. Thank you very much.
Dave.
And
thank you.
We'll see you on the next one. All right. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Lovely.
Bye.
Thanks, Dave. Bye.